A private jet had just landed at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. On the tarmac, the moment the cabin door opened, 4 grim-faced men walked straight onto the plane. As the man in charge of 2 auto giants, Nissan and Renault, Ghosn looked completely bewildered. He asked who they were and what they wanted, but he received no response. Helpless, he picked up his briefcase and coat and followed the men down from the plane. On the tarmac, 2 black sedans were already waiting. He was placed in the back seat, with a strange man on either side of him, completely unable to move freely. 20 minutes later, the convoy arrived at a completely gray building, its outer walls wrapped in a fine wire mesh. This was the Tokyo Detention Center. It wasn't until he was told to give his fingerprints, have his mugshot taken, and even undergo a strip search and change into a prison uniform that Ghosn suddenly realized this was no misunderstanding, but a long-planned arrest. He was locked in a tiny cell, with no right to contact the outside world or see his lawyer. 6 hours later, Japanese prosecutors held a press conference to officially announce that Ghosn had been arrested for financial misconduct, alleging that he had hidden $80 million in income over 8 years. Nissan executives then took the stage, accusing Ghosn of betraying the company's interests and damaging shareholder equity, declaring that justice would finally be served. But what they didn't realize was that this accusation, which seemed to be about money, was actually, at its core, a struggle for power, a power struggle. Ghosn had been pushing for a full merger between Nissan and Renault, and this plan would have given the French side control. The local Japanese executives wanted control. To protect the company's independence, they used financial issues as an opening and struck first to take him down. Ghosn sat in his cold cell, his heart filled with confusion and indignation. It was he who had turned things around, who had saved a near-bankrupt Nissan, creating billions of dollars in wealth for the company. And now, this was his fate. He would never willingly stay in Japan and stand trial, and he certainly wouldn't just give in. A full 400 days later, he would escape from house arrest, from under tight surveillance, and success, fully escape, completely leaving Japan for good. A thrilling escape. The countdown had already begun. From 2018, November, to 2019, March, Ghosn spent 108 days in a Tokyo detention center. During that time, he was not granted bail, nor was there a clear trial date. Day after day, interrogations became the norm. Every morning, at 8 o'clock, the guards would wake him on the dot and take him to the interrogation room. From 8:30 in the morning to 6 in the evening, the prosecutors would constantly circle back to his salary declarations and the use of funds, questioning him relentlessly. Even though Ghosn insisted all his actions were legal and compliant, and that he had written records to prove it, they completely ignored him. The conditions in the detention center were extremely harsh. Inside a cell of about 10 square meters, there were only concrete walls and a metal toilet with no privacy to speak of. Although his lawyers repeatedly submitted bail applications, they were all rejected, until countries like France and Brazil began to protest, and the pressure from the international community continued to mount. It wasn't until March 2019 that the Japanese authorities approved Ghosn's bail. The bail amount of $9 million set a record in Japanese judicial history. Even with bail granted, Ghosn still had to comply with strict conditions. He was under 24-hour non-stop surveillance and had to report to the police twice a week. On March 6th, Ghosn walked out of the detention center and, in Tokyo, rented a small apartment to begin preparing for his upcoming trial. But he had no idea that the real nightmare was just beginning. Ghosn, fast asleep, was jolted awake by a violent banging on his door. 20 prosecutors dressed in suits burst into his bedroom. Ghosn, still in a daze, was handcuffed and dragged from his bed. His wife, Carole, tried to step forward and stop them, but she was pushed aside and told not to interfere. This arrest stemmed from new charges. Ghosn was taken back to his previous cell. This time, he was held for another 30 days until May 4th, when he was granted bail once again. And for this bail, another $5 million was added, bringing the cumulative amount to $14 million. What was even harsher, his wife Carole was banned from entering Japan and was also accused of obstructing justice. The couple completely lost any chance of seeing or speaking to each other. Facing the upcoming trial, 65-year-old Ghosn knew well that if he were convicted, a 15-year prison sentence would be no different from a death sentence for him. The idea of escaping slowly began to form in his mind. On December 5, 2019, in a cafe in Beirut, Lebanon, Carole was meeting with a few people, a unique circle of contacts. Among them were former military personnel, security contractors, and specialists in international extractions. Carole explained the situation to them. Her husband was under house arrest, and in 4 months, he was scheduled to stand trial. He was facing prison time, and his life could even be in danger. She desperately needed help getting her husband out of this predicament. After hearing Carole's plea, the group immediately began to discuss a plan, studying maps, analyzing surveillance reports, and assessing every potential risk. One of them stated that the mission would be extremely difficult, fraught with danger, and would cost a fortune. But it wasn't entirely impossible. The core problem at the time was that all 3 of Ghosn's passports were locked away in his lawyer's safe, making it impossible for him to leave Japan legally. And with airport security being so strict, he'd be captured the moment he showed his face. After extensive deliberation, the group came up with a bold plan. They would use a private jet from a smaller, less secure airport and smuggle Ghosn out disguised as cargo to escape the country. As for how to hide him, someone proposed a daring idea. Ghosn would hide inside a large musical instrument case. Using a case as cover was the method least likely to arouse suspicion. 2 weeks later, a complete escape plan began to take shape. Step 1. Arrange for a band to perform at a private dinner party, using the music as a cover to get into Ghosn's residence. Step 2. Ghosn would hide inside a cello case and be carried out by the band members. Step 3. Transport him to Osaka, 500 kilometers from Tokyo. The airport there was smaller, and security was relatively lax. Step 4. Take a private jet to Istanbul, Turkey. Step 5. Switch to another plane and fly to Beirut, Lebanon, the day of the operation to reach the safe zone. The date was finally set for December 29th by a team of 6 former Special Forces members and security experts. They prepared a custom-made cello case, complete with internal padding and air holes. They also used cash to rent 2 private jets through a Turkish company and equipped themselves with forged passports and ID cards, as well as several backup plans for emergencies. Once everything was ready, Carole sent Ghosn a coded message. "Be ready on the 29th. Trust the band." When Ghosn saw the message, he immediately understood its meaning and quickly deleted it. The countdown to escape had officially begun. 2019, December 29th. At 7 p.m., a white van arrived outside Ghosn's residence as scheduled. 6 men in formal wear, carrying musical instruments, got out. Ghosn warmly opened the door and welcomed them inside. The men quickly set up their violins, cellos, a keyboard, and other instruments, along with a huge empty cello case. The band immediately began to play beautiful melodies. Ghosn sat alone, listening, but inside, his heart was pounding. The music continued for 90 minutes. Not too long, not too short, just right. At 8:45 p.m., the performance ended. As the men began to pack up their instruments, Ghosn made an excuse to go to the restroom. After walking down the hall, he was out of the surveillance camera's view. A member of the team was already waiting for him. He opened the custom-made cello case. The 65-year-old billionaire, the former auto industry titan, now had no other choice. He had to climb into this tiny space like a piece of cargo. The team member quickly sealed and locked the case, then moved it along with the other instruments, and moved it to the living room. The surveillance personnel watched them leave, noting the time down. 8:52 p.m. Musicians carrying equipment, leaving as normal. They had no idea that the person they were monitoring so closely was hidden inside the box. With the mission accomplished, the van quickly drove away from downtown Tokyo. It passed through multiple checkpoints, but no one would search a band after a performance. 30 minutes later, The van arrived at a hotel near Tokyo Station and pulled into the underground parking garage. Everyone carried the box into the hotel, taking the staff elevator to a room on the 3rd floor. The moment the box was opened, Ghosn climbed out, gasping for air, drenched in sweat, but he had successfully escaped his residence. The first stage of the escape plan was complete. The goal of the second stage was to take the bullet train to Osaka. At 9:30 p.m. on December 29th, Tokyo Station was bustling with people. Ghosn had deliberately put on a disguise to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. 2 operatives accompanied him. The 3 of them split up to buy tickets to Osaka and sat in separate train cars, minimizing the risk of being recognized. Ghosn sat alone in a window seat, his hands trembling slightly. This was the most dangerous part of the entire escape. If he were recognized, all their efforts would be for nothing. At 12:35 a.m. on December 30th, the train arrived at Osaka Station. The 3 exited the station separately and then successfully met up. A getaway car was already waiting nearby. They drove to a hotel near Kansai Airport and checked in under a fake name. Inside the room were 2 large speaker equipment cases. Ghosn understood. He would have to get back into the box, and this time, the box would be loaded onto a plane headed for another country. 1 a.m. The private terminal at Kansai Airport was nearly empty. 2 operatives pushed the equipment case towards a private jet. The flight plan was filed for Istanbul. The cargo was declared as audio equipment. The only passengers were the 2 operatives. Private jets don't need to go through the usual security screening process. The box was loaded directly into the cargo hold and secured. Then, the hatch was closed. 10 minutes later, the plane took off without a hitch. Inside the box, Ghosn struggled to remain calm, breathing with difficulty through the small air holes. At 5:26 a.m. Turkish time, the plane landed at the private terminal of Ataturk Airport. The local customs officials weren't very strict with private flights. They only registered their information and checked their documents. After the box was unloaded and pushed into a hangar, the operatives opened it. Ghosn was nearly unconscious, drenched in sweat, and severely dehydrated. The team quickly pulled him out. At 65 years old, he had been in the box for 11 hours, and his body was at its limit. But he had successfully made it to Turkey, completely free from Japan's control. After a brief rest, Ghosn was moved to a car. They drove across the airport to another terminal, where he once again boarded a smaller private jet. The destination, Beirut, Lebanon. The entire flight would only take 2 hours. At 6:03 a.m., the plane took off. Ghosn looked out the window, watching the sun slowly rise over Istanbul, his heart filled with a yearning for freedom. At 7:14 in the morning, the plane began its descent into Beirut's airport. The plane landed at the private terminal. Security personnel only briefly checked his Lebanese ID card before stamping it and letting him through. Stepping out of the airport, Ghosn felt a long-awaited sense of relief. His wife, Carole, and their children, who were waiting in the car, rushed to greet him. The family embraced, weeping. They held each other tightly. After 400 days of detainment, house arrest, and intense surveillance, Carlos Ghosn was finally free. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the surveillance team, on the morning of December 30th, noticed something was wrong. Usually at this time, Ghosn would be seen moving around by the window or walking about, but on that day, the house was dead silent. They checked the GPS tracker. The signal showed he was still inside the house, but there was no sign of movement. No one answered the door. Attempts to contact his lawyer were also unsuccessful. It wasn't until noon that the surveillance team broke into the house to search, only to discover that Ghosn was long gone. A severed GPS tracker was left abandoned on the floor. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department immediately issued an arrest warrant and contacted the Immigration Bureau to check, but they found no record of Ghosn ever leaving Japan. On December 31st, the news of Ghosn's escape to Lebanon broke. The Japanese authorities were utterly humiliated, facing unprecedented international shame. Japan immediately submitted an extradition request to Lebanon, but it was rejected. France and Brazil also rejected the extradition request for similar reasons. In the press conference that followed, Ghosn's 2-hour-long speech revealed what he called the entire truth of the incident. All the accusations had been fabricated by Nissan. Executives conspired to frame him to prevent a company merger. The Japanese justice system, he stressed, suffers from serious injustices like the presumption of guilt and forced confessions. He emphasized that he wasn't escaping justice, but rather fleeing an unjust trial. When reporters pressed for details about his escape, Ghosn refused to answer in order to protect those who had helped him. However, the Lebanese media had already exposed the entire escape process.